She was only 8 years old when she was kidnapped straight from her bedroom. Left for dead, her throat slit and her body dumped in a field, yet somehow she survived. What happened next would not only shock an entire town but decades later, bring her face to face with the man who tried to silence her forever. But what no one expected was his reaction. It was late on a humid August night in Dickinson, Texas, in 1990 when 8-year-old Jennifer Schuett went to bed like any other child her age. The sounds of summer hummed quietly outside her window, and the neighborhood remained still, draped in the illusion of safety that small towns often carry. But as Jennifer slept peacefully in her pink pajamas, unaware of the nightmare about to unfold, someone outside her home was watching. He wasn't a stranger to darkness or cruelty. He waited, patient, silent, determined. And when the time was right, he acted. Without a sound, he approached the house. He found Jennifer's bedroom window slightly ajar, just enough to slip a hand through. The screen was removed and within seconds he was inside. The room was dark still. Jennifer didn't wake as he crept closer. But when she did open her eyes, she was met not by her mother's familiar face, but by the hand of a man she had never seen before, clamped tightly over her mouth. She couldn't scream. She couldn't fight. He was too strong. Her heart pounded wildly as he lifted her from the bed, carried her through the window and disappeared into the night. The car ride was short, but every second stretched into eternity. Jennifer sat frozen in terror. The man driving didn't speak, didn't look at her. The silence was suffocating. She glanced around the vehicle trying to memorize details, what the seats looked like, the sound of the engine, the color of the dashboard. Even in her fear, something inside her told her that remembering might matter. They stopped in a remote field on the outskirts of town, an area surrounded by nothing but grass, gravel, and open sky. There were no lights, no roads, no one around to help. The man dragged her out of the car and into the tall weeds. That's where the nightmare worsened. What happened next was something no child should ever endure. Jennifer was violently assaulted, her innocence torn away in a matter of minutes. Her sobs were muffled by the crushing fear that this was how her life would end. Then came the blade. He held it to her neck and without a word, slashed it. The pain was searing. Her breath caught in her chest. Blood poured from the deep wound, soaking the ground beneath her. She lay there, the darkness closing in, unable to scream, unable to move. He left her in that field, assuming the cut would finish what he had started. He thought she would die before the sun came up. But Jennifer didn't die. Even as her blood stained the earth, even as her body began to shut down, she stayed awake. Paralyzed, mute, barely conscious, she stared up at the stars. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like days. Her throat burned with every shallow gasp for air. But in the back of her mind, a single thought repeated over and over: survive. As dawn approached, so did a miracle. A passerby walking near the field spotted what looked like a child lying motionless in the grass. At first he thought she was dead. But when he came closer, he saw something that would haunt him forever. Jennifer's eyes blinking slowly, silently begging for help. Paramedics were called immediately. Jennifer was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The doctors were stunned that she was alive at all. Her throat had been cut so severely that she couldn't speak. Her vocal cords had been partially severed. The fact that she hadn't bled out was nothing short of a miracle. But she was conscious. She was aware. And she remembered. When police arrived to take her statement, she couldn't talk. But Jennifer found another way. She asked for a pencil and paper and began writing. Slowly, shakily but clearly she gave them everything she could recall. What the man looked like, what kind of car he drove, what direction they traveled, even the knife. Her hands trembled with pain, but she didn't stop. Every word she wrote became a lifeline, a clue, a defiance of death itself. A sketch was drawn from her notes. Detectives canvassed the area. The town of Dickinson was thrown into panic. Parents no longer let their children sleep with the windows open. Locks were reinforced. Flashlights were kept by bedsides. But despite the public's fear and the police's urgency, no arrest was made. There were no fingerprints, no solid leads. And DNA testing in 1990 wasn't yet advanced enough to identify the attacker from the limited evidence they had. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The case began to fade from headlines. But Jennifer's recovery was just beginning. She underwent surgery and began speech therapy. Her voice, though forever changed, slowly returned. Her body healed with time, but her mind carried the weight of that night like a shadow that never left. And yet she never stopped fighting. Not to forget. Not to move on. But to make sure the man who did this would one day be found. Even at 8 years old, Jennifer Schuett had already decided, She would not be a victim. She would be the voice that couldn't be silenced. Jennifer's hospital room was filled with the quiet beeping of machines and the soft shuffling of nurses' feet. Her throat was wrapped in white gauze, her eyes heavy with pain, but her mind, sharp, focused, determined, was already working. She couldn't speak, not yet, but her need to communicate overpowered everything. A nurse placed a notepad in her lap and handed her a pencil. With trembling hands, Jennifer began to write. She jotted down every detail she could remember. His hair was dark, his arms strong, he smelled like smoke. The car had a soft seatbelt, a strange dashboard light. She described the field, the night sky, the sound of the gravel under the tires. She didn't stop writing until the pain forced her hand to drop. A sketch artist visited shortly after, drawing a composite image based solely on her notes. Investigators marveled at her memory, at the way this 8-year-old, who had come closer to death than most adults ever would, refused to give in. She wanted justice, even if she had to whisper it onto paper. But justice wouldn't come easy. In the early 1990s, DNA technology was still limited. There was no match in the system. No solid leads. The composite sketch led nowhere. No witnesses. No suspects. No fingerprints. Just a child's testimony and a mountain of questions. The investigation stalled. As months turned into years, the file on Jennifer Schuett's case grew thick with dead ends. Detectives moved on to newer cases. The media lost interest. And slowly the case went cold. Jennifer, however, never forgot. As she grew older, her voice came back, quiet at first, raspy, uneven. She spent years in speech therapy, learning to talk again, learning to reclaim what had been taken from her. But her scars remained, on her throat, yes, but also deep inside her. Despite those wounds, Jennifer never became bitter. She became bold. By her teenage years, she was already speaking publicly, telling her story to schools, to survivor support groups, to anyone who would listen. Her message was never one of fear, but of survival. Every birthday she celebrated past age 8 was a victory. Every time she looked in the mirror and saw her scar, it reminded her that she had lived. And though her attacker still walked free, Jennifer was determined not to let him define her. She pursued a normal life, working, dating, trying to find peace. But the shadow of that night in 1990 was never far behind. Every dark alley, every strange face, every creak in the night reminded her that he was still out there. She didn't wait for the system to fix things. She pushed it. By the time she reached adulthood, forensic science had leaped forward. DNA testing had become more precise, more accessible. Jennifer contacted detectives, asking them to revisit her case. She wanted the evidence retested. She wanted the swabs, the clothing, anything that had been collected from that field examined with modern tools. She knew the man had left something behind, some microscopic trace that could speak for her. In 2008, nearly 18 years after she was left to die, her persistence paid off. The evidence from her case was sent for DNA analysis. The process took time, months even, but Jennifer waited with a kind of stillness she had mastered since childhood. She'd waited this long. She could wait a little more. Then the call came. The DNA matched a man named Dennis Earl Bradford. He was already in prison, serving time for attempting to kill his ex-wife. A violent offender. A repeat predator. A man who had left behind enough of himself in that field to be caught. Jennifer sat in silence as detectives told her the name, the charges, the evidence. She listened, absorbed it all. And then she looked them in the eyes and said something they didn't expect. "I want to meet him." It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was something deeper. Jennifer had spent most of her life with unanswered questions. Now she wanted answers. She wanted to face the man who had tried to erase her. She wanted him to see the woman she had become, not broken, not silenced, but stronger than he ever imagined. The news of the DNA match hit the media like a storm. A case long thought forgotten was suddenly back in the spotlight. Jennifer spoke publicly again, this time with new strength, telling the world that justice was within reach. Her story became a rallying cry for survivors of cold cases. She urged others not to give up, to keep pushing, to believe that even after decades, justice was possible. For Jennifer, it was never just about catching a criminal. It was about closure. About taking back control of a life that had been hijacked in the middle of a summer night. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was leading a fight, for herself, for other victims, and for the little girl who had refused to die in a field all those years ago. Jennifer had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment. After years of silence, surgeries, nightmares, and questions with no answers, the man who had tried to take her life had finally been found. Dennis Earl Bradford, now in custody, was no longer a faceless shadow. He had a name, a criminal history, and soon he would face the very child he'd left for dead. But what no one could have predicted was how he would respond to finally facing the truth. After the DNA match in 2008, Bradford was arrested in Arkansas, where he had been living a seemingly normal life with a wife and children. The news stunned not just the community, but investigators who had reviewed his past. This wasn't a man who had disappeared into isolation. He had been functioning in society, holding jobs, raising a family, all while keeping a monstrous secret buried beneath his skin. When detectives informed Jennifer of his capture, she didn't cry. She didn't break. She remained composed, holding on to a calm that came not from relief, but from long-practiced endurance. During the interviews following his arrest, Bradford initially denied involvement. But the evidence was unshakable. The DNA from the crime scene matched him perfectly. There was no ambiguity. And as investigators pressed harder, the dam finally broke. He confessed, not with resistance but with a startling emotional collapse. He wept. He told officers he had no idea Jennifer had survived. In his mind, the case had been over the moment he drove away from that field. He believed he had killed her. And now, nearly 20 years later, the realization that she had lived, and was coming for him, shattered whatever cold defenses he had built over the years. Detectives later said they had never seen anything like it. A grown man, tattooed, broad-shouldered, hardened by time and crime, reduced to tears, rocking in his chair as if haunted by the ghost of an 8-year-old girl. It wasn't guilt that undid him. It was fear. Jennifer's survival was something he never expected. And it made her stronger than him. It meant he had failed, not just as a murderer, but as a monster who thought he'd buried his past. Jennifer, on the other hand, didn't want sympathy. She wanted truth. She had asked for a meeting. She wanted to look him in the eye, to let him see who she had become. The little girl with the slit throat was now a woman who refused to be forgotten. The confrontation was being scheduled. Prosecutors were preparing for trial. Jennifer would testify. She was ready to relive every moment of that horrible night, not for herself but for justice. But before that day came, everything changed. In May 2010, just months before the trial was set to begin, Dennis Earl Bradford was found dead in his jail cell. He had hanged himself. No note, no explanation. Just silence once again. The man who had stolen Jennifer's voice all those years ago had chosen to silence his own. The news hit hard, not because Jennifer wanted revenge but because she had wanted answers. She had waited 19 years to ask him why. And now, that question would never be answered. Still, it wasn't a defeat. Jennifer stood before the cameras once more, scar visible, voice unwavering, and told the world that she was still standing. That her story wasn't over. That justice, in some strange and bitter form, had been served. The man who tried to kill her would never harm another child. And though she never got to face him in court, she had already won the most important battle. She had survived him. In the years that followed, Jennifer Schuett became more than just a survivor. She became an advocate, a speaker, a symbol of unbreakable spirit. Her story was shared across the country. She pushed for cold case funding, for better support systems for child victims, and for the importance of never giving up on justice, no matter how much time has passed. Her voice, once nearly destroyed, had become louder than ever. She would later say that survival wasn't just about living through something. It was about choosing every day not to let it define you. The man who abducted her had chosen to end his story with a noose. Jennifer chose to keep telling hers. Not in whispers but in bold, defiant, unforgettable words. And in doing so, she made sure that the little girl left for dead in a Texas field would never be forgotten.